Megan. Happy Pride.
Happy Pride, Justin. All right, so this month we're celebrating the LGBTQIA plus community and promoting equitable rights and opportunities. In this Transforming Social Justice episode, we're going to talk about heterosexism, which here at Us Squared we define as discrimination, prejudice, or stereotyping based on perceived or actual sexuality.
Yes, and today we will talk about how this form of bias impacts individuals and organizations, both in the educational and the business space.
All right, so Justin, before we dive into the conversation, I want to take a moment to differentiate between gender and sexuality. Pride Month actually celebrates and takes a moment to look at both gender and sexuality, which is why we have all of the letters of LGBTQIA+. However, within those letters, there's actually two very distinct identity groups. We have the idea of gender and we have the idea of sexuality. Now, within the month of June with Us Squared, we're going to focus on heterosexism, which is specifically around sexuality. And the letters that align with sexuality are L, G, B, Q, and A. Now, L is for lesbian, G is for gay, B is for bisexual, Q is for queer, and A is for asexual. Now, when we're talking about sexuality, it's not just about a physical connection. It's also about a romantic connection. It is about who you are attracted to, whether you're attracted to someone of the same gender, of a different gender, maybe someone who is gender fluid, which is what we talk about with the idea of queer. But that is what we are going to be focusing on within heterosexism. On the other side of it, the other letters of T and I, in addition to Q, because the Q is actually both aligned with gender and sexuality, is the idea of gender. And we're going to talk about those within cisgenderism, which is later in the year. Now, just really quickly, T is for transgender and I is for intersex. And then Q again is for queer. You'll notice that the Q is in both gender and sexuality, and really what it means is fluid. So it is where there's not a specific binary response. It is a very fluid, depending on where you're at in that moment and kind of what's going on in your head, or maybe you just don't align with one specific answer. And that is what we identify as queer. It is important to differentiate between the two. And I wanted to take a moment, and I know I've kind of been on my soapbox here for a minute, but it's important to differentiate between the two because gender does not determine sexuality, nor does sexuality determine gender. And in our society, we often convolute the two terms, and it's critical for us to understand the differences. If we truly want to better understand either our own identity and or someone else's identity, we need to make sure that we're not putting in those absolutes. Um, and we need to talk about them openly. So Pride celebrates both the gender and sexuality spectrum. But before we dive into heterosexism specifically, let's talk a little bit more about Pride Month. So Justin, can you share a little bit more about the history of Pride Month and why that's significant to the LGBTQIA plus community?
Yes, so Pride Month commemorates the Stonewall riots in June of 1969, which really marked a pivotal moment in LGBTQIA plus rights movement. And it's significant because it honors the struggle for equity and celebrates the progress made throughout the last few decades, and while also recognizing the ongoing struggle against bias and discrimination. And Pride Month is a critical element of societal awareness regarding both gender and sexuality, like you discussed. However, within this episode of Transforming Social Justice, we will be focusing on the sexuality piece.
And that's important for us here at Us Squared, right? Ultimately, we want every individual to be seen, heard, welcomed, and valued, regardless of their sexuality or sex identity. Um,
Yeah, exactly. And
yeah.
yes, uh, you were a school superintendent, right, Megan? And why is inclusive representation in curriculum important in the LGBTQA students, and what does that mean?
Yeah, this is such a great question. And it's one that we get a lot of pushback and just difference of opinion, right? Inclusive education validates not just the student identities, but other diverse identities as well, which is ultimately what we want. We want all of our students to have that sense of belonging. And as educators, we can foster that. It educates all students about diversity and inclusion, promoting empathy and understanding. And it ultimately lessens challenges for queer students, but also increases the awareness for other students as well. And providing this sense of belonging starts as soon as children enter school. Reading picture books that showcase different types of family dynamics is a great first step. We talk about the idea of familialism in the summer because children are starting to spend more time with their families because they're not in school. But familialism is a large component of heterosexism. It's about family structure and who's in your family. And if we think to really young children, reading picture books and always seeing families where it's either we're getting better about having single parents, or it's a two-parent household, but both parents are opposite gender. What is really interesting is, and something for us to think about is, what about those children who are growing up in a household with two mommies or two daddies or two adults in the household that might not align with those gender norms in our society? So it's important to have that. Um, and then making sure that we're having those conversations consistently. So, for example, like Justin, as you were growing up in the school systems, do you remember some of the picture books you read?
Yes, and uh, I barely see any of those representation. I know I've said in previous episodes that I grew up in the Philippines, so
Yeah.
in the early stages in school, that's not something that's really talked about.
Right. And it's not different here in the US. I mean, I remember being in school. I can't tell you the exact title of books that I read, but I remember seeing a whole bunch of families that looked like mine. Right. And I had a mom and dad at home. And I remember being like, oh, I can relate to that because that looks like my family. I can't imagine if I had a different identity group, what that would be. Right. So bringing that in super early is absolutely possible and something that we encourage people to do. Um, I know that this can be extremely difficult because of community pushback. And we're going to talk a little bit later in the episode about what we're not doing by doing that. What I mean by that is we're not forcing an opinion on anyone. We're simply providing exposure. We'll talk a little bit more about that later. But as children age, it's important to go beyond just the picture books. It's critical for students who identify as part of the community to see themselves represented in history as well and to be taught about the history of their identity. You talked about Stonewall and you talked about those components in 1969. That's a critical part of our history, but very few history books actually talk about that in our school systems. And that's an important part of history. So it's important for people outside of the community, the LGBTQIA plus community, to see other identities represented. And it's important for people within the community to learn about their own history and to feel like they're a part of the conversation.
Yes, and LGBTQA students often face bullying, discrimination, and a lack of representation, right?
Absolutely. Bullying and discrimination can really affect student success, and we're seeing an increase in that over the last probably 6 or 7 years. I'd have to look at the exact data on it, but over the last 6 or 7 years, we've seen an increase in bullying and discrimination, specifically around sexuality. And these students who are bullied can experience mental health issues, poor academic performance. Now, bullying is a direct act. It is a direct act of hatred. Sometimes it's a direct act of just not knowing or not understanding the impact, but it is a direct act. There's also an undercurrent of indirect acts in our schools right now. And those indirect acts are the lack of discussion and the shaming of the community. And I think this is often done by people who, number one, either don't feel comfortable talking about it because they've never been taught how to talk about it and it's a different lived experience, right? I mean, I fell into that bucket myself as a young teacher. There were a lot of areas of social justice that I was never taught about, so I felt really uncomfortable talking about. And I didn't have lived experiences to pull from. So I think that's part of it. Another part of it is community pushback and people saying we don't talk about that in school. But we need to have these discussions and we need to be able to help society and different communities see that shaming of different groups, especially our students, is not going to help anyone forward.
Megan, what can educators and schools do to address these issues and ensure that all students are included?
Schools can start by creating and implementing inclusive policies. This includes direct inclusion of sexuality into anti-discrimination and anti-bullying policies. We're seeing some of that, right? We're seeing how some states are including in the protected classes sexuality and identity. And we need to make sure that these policies are clearly communicated and observed. So it's one thing to have a policy in place, but we need to actually make sure that that policy is reinforced. In addition, we can provide comprehensive training for staff on sexuality and LGBTQA topics. Some of those topics could be recognizing and addressing microaggressions, understanding the diversity of sexual identities. It is not just lesbian, gay, bisexual, which so many people assume is the reality of it. And then also using inclusive language around sexuality. Sexuality is definitely, and I know we shared this a little bit already, but sexuality is one of the most controversial topics in education because many people believe there's no place for it in our schools, right? That's not where it should be talked about. I want to provide some insight because I think that'll be helpful for us to realize that there is a difference between what we're promoting. Ensuring representation is not the same as teaching about something. So we are ensuring or we are inviting people to ensure representation. We're not necessarily telling people or teaching them how to be, right? We're not ever teaching a child how to be straight. So why would we teach a child how to be not straight? That's not what we're doing. That's not what we're promoting. Providing history of an identity is not a persuasive technique, right? If we talk about the history of specific identity groups, that's not saying you should be this way. And I'm saying these specifically worded in this way because that is some of the fear in our society is that if we talk about it, then we're persuading someone to become part of that community. That's not how it works. And I know that there's difference of opinion there, but I will just say, scientifically speaking, it is not the way sexuality works. Every time classrooms read literature with a family or about someone who has a crush on someone, think about all of the literature we read where they have people who have a crush on someone, or maybe movies we watch or shows we watch. It's all about they call it puppy love, right? Well, guess what? Every time that happens, you're inadvertently discussing sexuality. But society doesn't see it that way because it falls into the heteronormative culture. All we're asking for is the opportunity for every child to see themselves and their families represented in the schools. We're not encouraging schools to teach about sexuality unless it's a sex ed course. And then, yes, we ask that all identities are included within that sex ed course. But just like we don't teach theory to children who are not in a theory class, we're not going to teach about sexuality or sex ed unless we're in a course where that makes sense. We're not asking anyone to persuade anybody about anything, especially an aspect of a child's unique identity. We're not telling anyone to tell someone else how they should or should not be. Remember, at us squared, we don't use the word should. And yes, we are definitely inviting schools to read literature and picture books that include non-stereotypical representation of all identities. Now, I don't know if anyone else can tell, but my inflection got a little bit more animated during this section because I think this is one of the sections that I have to have the conversation around the most is, well, if we talk about it, then that means it's going to persuade someone to become part of the community. No, no, that's not accurate, and when we talk about there's jokes in the community, right? Those ideas of, oh, you get a toaster if you transfer someone over. That's not how it actually works, and it doesn't work that way in our school systems either. And another piece we say a lot is, oh, my children are too young to learn about this. Here's the thing. If children are old enough to experience it on a daily basis, then other children are old enough to learn about it. Now, are there age appropriate ways to talk about different components? Absolutely. And at the younger ages, all we're asking for is for people to be able to see themselves and their family structures represented. So what I mean by that is making sure that children can see families that don't necessarily fall into the heteronormative component when they're reading a picture book, when they're listening to a story. And I think that's critical.
Yes, and that's just talking about heterosexism in the classrooms, right? But
Right.
heteronormative norms uh, are also affect in the professional setting, and that's a whole other conversation. So LGBTQA employees are also impacted by heterosexism from unwelcoming to downright hostile work environments, like unfair treatment and inequitable access to career progression.
Absolutely, Justin. In a 2021 survey conducted by the Williams Institute, over 40% of LGBT workers reported experiencing unfair treatment at work, including being fired, not hired, or harassed because of their sexuality. Many queer employees opt not to come out. They hide their identities due to the fear of being discriminated against. This is especially true for sexuality. Many people choose to cloak their sexuality. Now, what I mean by cloak, it's not closeted. It's not that they're hiding it from everyone. What this means is that they only reveal, they only uncloak to people, places that they feel safe. Recognizing that treatment in society is often for people who better, it's often better for people who identify as heterosexual. So when people will cloak their sexuality or their sexual identity, it's not that they're hiding it. They're not in a closet. They're not completely isolated from the world. They are living their authentic self, but they're not necessarily disclosing that or showcasing that in every environment. And especially in the work environment, we see this more and more where people are choosing to cloak their sexual identity or their sexuality.
Yeah, coming out at work, that's like a whole can of worms right there, right? And it's a deeply personal decision. Like, I'd say for me, being queer and being part of a few organizations, there are some organizations I chose to come out to, and some that I chose to cloak just for my safety. And it can either be liberating and you get support from your peers, the people you work with, your colleagues, or the complete other way around. And I find that assessing the workplace culture and preparing for different reactions are useful tips if you're hesitant to inform your colleagues or your peers.
Yeah. And I'm thinking about this as a leader, right? Because you shared that some workplaces you've chosen to come out and others you have not. And I would think that part of that is because of the leader in the organization. Would that be fair to say?
I'd say so, yes.
Yeah, I mean, it's important to look at all of your colleagues and everyone in the environment. But I think as leaders, it's crucial for us to foster an environment where we bring people onto our teams that can be inclusive, right? We want our employees to feel safe and be able to express who they are. And as leaders, we have the opportunity to not only embody those principles ourselves, but also to make sure that everyone on our team knows how critical and important it is to be inclusive, making sure that we're practicing inclusive language, supporting ERGs or employee resource groups, providing trainings. These are just a few things that we can do in our work environments to support and foster LGBTQA friendly spaces.
Yes, and I'm thinking about the commitment piece of ensuring LGBTQA employees are seen, heard, welcomed, and valued. And circling back to Pride Month and the idea of rainbow capitalism. So, in today's society, if a brand puts on a rainbow logo but lacks the meaningful action to support the cause, they're most likely going to receive criticism. And I think that it's great that not only are we holding government institutions accountable, but also private companies as well.
Yeah, I mean, let's think about this for a moment. During the month of June, as you walk into most major retailers, you will see a large pride display, often at the front of the store, right? You see rainbows, pride apparel, merchandise, etc. Some businesses will even change their uniform to allow for pride apparel during the month. However, as soon as July rolls around, that display is gone in many cases. You'll even see quite a bit of clearance pride merchandise. There are some companies, however, who have committed to having representative merchandise year round. This idea is more representative of our B2Cs or businesses who sell to consumers.
But it's also important for B2Bs or businesses who sell to businesses to also be mindful of diversity, right?
Absolutely. So, in a 2023 McKinsey report, top companies for diversity had a 39% likelihood of outperforming their less diverse peers. So, that's typically in our B2Bs, right? While visible and vocal support is important, organizations that implement inclusive strategies for employees and contribute those authentic efforts in uplifting the community all year round can create meaningful impact in our society and are more likely to succeed. Interestingly enough, as I'm saying, the studies are showing a steady decline of pride-related initiatives over the last 3 years. There are a lot of factors that are contributing to this, right? We've got backlash from consumers, criticisms from the community regarding authenticity, shifting political landscape. But in addition to the decline in pride-related initiatives, we're seeing an overall decrease in pride or in DEI related initiatives after the spiked increase in 2020. So we were going along, it was pretty much a plateau, and then 2020 came and we saw a stark increase in DEI initiatives. Really predominantly after the murder of George Floyd, right? We saw people promoted to CDOs or chief diversity officers. We saw a lot more initiatives. We saw more commercials about social justice. But now, since the beginning of this year, we've seen a stark decrease. We are seeing articles where universities are prohibiting the work. We are seeing state level prohibiting the work. We are seeing government funding being cut in this work. We're seeing private companies say, we're going to spend our money elsewhere. We have to be mindful of our initiatives and the impact on our communities. We saw an increased sense of belonging and longer retention rates amongst employees, even during the pandemic when we were focused on inclusive environments. Those companies that had a DEI focus, when other people were losing employees left and right, people who had a strong commitment to DEI were showing an increase in retention and ultimately better productivity and profitability, right? As we move away from that focus and as we start to decrease our efforts in DEI initiatives, it's important for us to monitor workplace culture and the impact on productivity and profitability. Because if we're going to follow the trends, we saw an increase in productivity when we saw an increase in DEI initiatives. So on the other end of that, when we're decreasing our DEI initiatives, do we expect that the productivity and profitability and retention rate of our employees will also decrease? Something for us
Yeah,
to think about in
and
business.
yeah, definitely. So that's a lot of useful insight, Megan, and thank you again so much for that. And but that's all the time we really have for today. So if anyone has any questions that they'd like to ask Megan, I, or someone else on our team to answer next time, please drop a comment or email us at info@us2consulting.com.
Check out other episodes of Transforming Social Justice available on Spotify and YouTube, and join us again next time for another meaningful conversation that can inspire change within our communities and beyond, fostering a future where everyone is seen, heard, welcomed, and valued. Thank you again, Justin, and thank you everyone else. Hope to see you again soon.